The late afternoon sun hung low over the Texas horizon, painting the dusty road in shades of amber and rust. Clara Whitfield stood beside an old wagon, its wheels caked with dried mud. Her trunk and carpet bags scattered on the ground like abandoned dreams. In her trembling hand, she clutched half a letter. The other half danced away on the prairie wind, carrying with it promises that would never be kept. Her navy traveling dress, once crisp and hopeful, now bore the dust of 3 days' journey from Missouri. The matching hat sat askew, its ribbon torn where she'd caught it on the stagecoach door. She'd spent her last coins on that coach fare, believing she was heading toward a new life as Mrs. Samuel Morrison. Now she stood at the edge of nowhere, outside a ranch that belonged to a man who'd vanished like smoke. The Morrison place looked as abandoned as she felt. The gate hung crooked, and tumbleweeds gathered against the porch steps. No smoke rose from the chimney. No horses stood in the corral. Even the chickens had gone, leaving only scattered feathers to mark their passing. Clara pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to sink into the dirt and weep. 24 years old, with no family back east to return to and no money to get there if she had. She'd sold everything, her mother's china, her father's watch, even the small plot of land they'd left her, to afford this journey and the modest dowry Samuel had requested in his letters. The sound of hoofbeats made her straighten her spine. A lone rider approached from the west, his silhouette dark against the fading light. As he drew closer, she could make out a tall man on a bay horse, his hat pulled low against the sun. He slowed as he neared, taking in the scene with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read trouble from a distance. Luke Hammond had been riding his property line when he spotted the woman. At first, he'd thought she might be one of the traveling ladies from the saloons, but the quality of her dress and the scattered luggage told a different story. He'd heard talk in town about Sam Morrison courting some woman through letters, but Luke had figured it for saloon gossip. Sam had lit out 2 weeks back, claiming pressing business in California, left his stock to starve and his debts unpaid. Luke dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The woman watched him with eyes the color of prairie sage, wary but not frightened. Good. Fear made people do foolish things out here. Ma'am. He touched the brim of his hat. You waiting on Sam Morrison? Her chin lifted a fraction. I am Miss Clara Whitfield. I've come from Independence to marry Mr. Morrison. The words came out steady, but he caught the tremor underneath. He was to meet me 3 days ago at the stage stop in Amarillo. Luke studied her for a moment. She had the look of someone who'd been bred to better things. Straight spine, careful diction, hands that had known kid gloves more than rough work. But there was steel there, too, in the set of her jaw and the way she met his gaze directly. Sam's gone, he said simply. No point in dancing around the truth. Left 2 weeks past, doubt he's coming back. He watched her absorb the blow. Her fingers tightened on the torn letter, knuckles white beneath her traveling gloves. But she didn't cry or carry on, just stood there, processing the ruin of her plans with a dignity that stirred something in his chest. I see. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat, tried again. I don't suppose you know where I might find lodging or employment? Luke glanced at the sinking sun. Town was 5 miles east, and the boarding house there was no place for a woman alone. Mrs. Grundy ran it like a way station for drifters and drummed up her real business after dark. As for employment, a woman with those soft hands wouldn't last a day at the laundry. And the saloons. Well, that wasn't a thought worth entertaining. Gets dark quick out here, he said. Town's a fair piece, and the road's no place for a woman alone after sundown. She followed his gaze to the horizon, where the first stars were already pricking through the purple dusk. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, answered by another. Her shoulders sagged just a fraction before she caught herself. I'll manage, she said, though they both knew it for a lie. Luke made a decision that would have shocked him if he'd stopped to think on it, but something about her standing there, abandoned but unbroken, called to the same part of him that took in stray calves and mended bird wings as a boy. My place is just over that rise, he said, nodding north. Got a spare room with a door that locks from the inside. You can stay the night. Figure things out come morning." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Hammond, Luke Hammond, and it's not charity." He bent to pick up her trunk, grunting at the weight. "Books, by the feel of it. It's common decency. Can't leave you out here for the coyotes and worse." She studied him for a long moment. He knew what she saw, a man past 35, weathered by sun and wind. Clothes worn but clean, boots mended but solid. His mother had raised him to speak quiet and move careful around womenfolk, and he'd hoped that showed too. "I can pay," she said finally. "Not much, but we'll sort that come morning." He hefted the trunk into his wagon bed, then reached for her carpet bag. "Right now, we need to get moving. Storm's building in the west." She looked where he pointed, seeing the dark clouds massing on the horizon. The wind had picked up, sending more pieces of Samuel's letters spinning into the gathering dark. With movements that spoke of hard-won practicality, she unpinned her hat and secured it to her bag, then accepted his offered hand up onto the wagon seat. Luke clicked to the horses and they moved off, leaving the Morrison place to its emptiness. Clara sat rigid beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed ahead. He didn't try to make conversation. Words wouldn't help what ailed her, and he'd learned long ago the value of letting folks sit with their troubles until they were ready to speak. His ranch appeared as full dark settled in, lamplight glowing warm through the windows. It wasn't much, a 2-room house with a kitchen lean-to, barn and corral, smokehouse and chicken coop. But the fences stood straight. The buildings were tight against weather, and smoke rose welcoming from the chimney. "It's not fancy," he said as he helped her down. "It's standing and occupied." She replied, "That puts it well ahead of my other options." Despite everything, he felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. She had grit. This Clara Whitfield question was whether she had enough to survive what the frontier would throw at her. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, he'd offer what comfort he could, a safe room, a hot meal, and the dignity of being treated like a guest rather than a charity case. It wasn't much, but it was what he had to give. And sometimes, he'd learned, that was enough to make the difference between falling and finding your feet again. As he carried her trunk inside, Clara paused on the porch, looking back at the road that had brought her to this moment. Somewhere out there, Samuel Morrison was running from his responsibilities, but here, in this simple house with its promise of walls and warmth, a different man was quietly shouldering the burden Samuel had abandoned. She didn't know yet what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, she had shelter. And in a world that had just tilted off its axis, that was no small gift. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and something savory, beans. Clara realized, simmering on the cast-iron stove. Luke Hammond moved through the small space with the efficiency of a man long accustomed to tending himself. He pulled a tin plate from a shelf, ladled beans beside a thick slice of cornbread, and set it before her without ceremony. "Coffee's hot if you want it," he said, already turning back to the stove. "Cups are on that shelf." Clara sat at the rough pine table, its surface worn smooth by years of use. The beans were simple fare, salt pork, onions. Nothing fancy, but they were hot and filling, and her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager breakfast. She ate slowly, partly from ingrained manners and partly to avoid meeting Luke's eyes as he moved about the kitchen. The house revealed itself in details, clean, but with the particular bareness of a bachelor's dwelling. A shelf held a dozen books, spines worn from reading. A rifle rested on pegs above the door. The windows had no curtains, but the glass was clean, and a rag rug covered the floor beside the stove. Everything spoke of function over comfort. Yet there was order here, a kind of rough contentment that made her chest tight with unexpected longing. Luke poured his own coffee and leaned against the wall, studying her with that same careful assessment from the road. "Spare rooms through there," he said, nodding toward a door. "Was my parents' room, back when beds made up fresh. There's a bolt on the inside." The last part hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of the impropriety of their situation, and his promise that she need not fear it. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Hammond. I'll be gone first thing tomorrow. We'll see what tomorrow brings." He drained his coffee, set the cup in the wash basin. "Pumps out back if you need water. Privy's beyond the chicken coop. I'll be in the barn checking on a sick calf, so you'll have the house to yourself for a spell." He took his hat from a peg and went out, leaving Clara alone with the crackling stove and the weight of her circumstances. She finished her meal, washed her plate and cup. Her mother had raised no slovenly daughters, even if there was only one left now, and finally made herself open the door to the spare room. It was small but clean, dominated by an iron bedstead with a quilt that looked hand-pieced. A washstand held a china basin and pitcher, and hooks on the wall served for a wardrobe. The promised bolt was there, solid and recently oiled. She crossed to the single window and looked out at the darkness, seeing only her own reflection in the glass, a woman she hardly recognized, travel-worn and adrift, moving mechanically. She unpinned her hair and brushed it out, changed into her nightdress, and performed her evening ablutions with water from the pitcher. The bed, when she finally climbed into it, smelled of sage and sunshine, as if the linens had dried on a line under the Texas sky. She lay stiff and wakeful, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind under the eaves. Sometime later, she heard Luke's boots on the porch, the quiet sounds of him banking the stove and checking the doors. His footsteps paused outside her room, and she held her breath, but they moved on. A door closed somewhere, then silence. Clara turned her face into the pillow and finally let the tears come. Not great sobs, she'd learned long ago to cry quietly, but the slow, burning kind that acknowledged the death of dreams. She'd imagined this night so differently. A husband's arms, a home of her own, the promise of children and belonging. Instead, she lay in a stranger's bed, her future as empty as her purse. But even through her tears, a small part of her mind was working, planning. She couldn't go back east. No money, no family, nothing but graves in the independent cemetery. She'd have to find work, save enough for what? Another journey to another promise that might prove equally false? Sleep took her still worrying at the problem, and she dreamed of letters turning to ash in her hands. Morning came with a rooster's crow and the smell of coffee. Clara dressed quickly, pinning her hair with fingers that shook only slightly. When she emerged, Luke was already at the stove, frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced at her, noted the shadows under her eyes, but said nothing about them. "Morning," was all he offered, sliding eggs onto a plate beside more cornbread. They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness of the night before eased by daylight and hot food. Clara noticed things she'd missed in last evening's shock, the careful mending on Luke's shirt cuffs, the way he held his coffee cup to warm fingers scarred by years of rope work, the patient stillness that seemed to surround him like a second skin. "I should go into town," she said finally. "Look for work." Luke nodded. "I'm heading that way after chores. You can ride along." He paused, seemed to weigh his words. "Might want to think on what kind of work you're suited for. Town's not got much call for, that is, work's hard to come by for anyone. Harder for women folk." Clara's spine stiffened. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Hammond." "Didn't say you were." His voice stayed mild, but his eyes were knowing. "Just saying you might want to set your expectations according, Mrs. Holcomb at the boarding house sometimes needs help with washing. Miller's store might need a clerk, though he usually hires his relations. The saloon, I won't work in a saloon." The words came sharp and final. "Good." He stood, started clearing plates. "Wouldn't have let you ride away if that was your intention." The presumption should have angered her, but something in his tone, protective rather than proprietary, smoothed her ruffled feathers. She helped clear the table, noting how they moved around each other in the small space without colliding, already learning each other's patterns. While Luke tended his morning chores, Clara tidied the kitchen and made a mental inventory of her assets. 3 dresses besides her traveling clothes, all too fine for hard labor. Her books, but who would buy books out here? Her mother's garnet earrings, saved for her wedding day. They might bring enough for a week's lodging, maybe 2 if she was careful. When Luke returned, he'd washed at the pump and changed his shirt. Ready? The ride to town took an hour through country that showed spring's touch in wildflowers and green grass. Luke pointed out landmarks. Mustang Creek, the box canyon where cattle sheltered in storms, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the halfway point. Clara found herself memorizing the route without meaning to, as if her mind was already preparing for a life lived in this harsh, beautiful land. The town, when it appeared, was exactly what she'd feared. One main street, a handful of businesses, and too many curious eyes. Luke stopped the wagon outside Miller's general store. "I'll be at the feed store, then the bank. Meet back here in 2 hours?" Clara nodded, squaring her shoulders as she climbed down. Time to discover what remained of Clara Whitfield's prospects in this place at the edge of nowhere. Miller's store smelled of pickle brine and leather. Mr. Miller himself, a narrow man with suspicious eyes, heard her inquiry about employment and shook his head before she'd finished speaking. "Got all the help I need from family," he said, already turning away. The boarding house was worse. Mrs. Holcomb looked her up and down like she was calculating the price of Clara's dress. "Washing's hard work," she said with evident satisfaction. "$1 a week, room and board. You'd share with the other girls." The way she said girls made Clara's skin crawl. "I'll consider it." Clara managed, though they both knew she wouldn't. The afternoon wore on in a series of closed doors and head shakes. The seamstress had no need for help. The restaurant was family-run. Even the schoolhouse, her last desperate thought, stood empty. The teacher had left 6 months back, and the town hadn't found a replacement. By the time she met Luke at the wagon, her feet hurt and her pride was in tatters. He took one look at her face and didn't ask how it had gone. They rode back in silence heavier than the mornings, the weight of limited choices pressing down like the afternoon heat. As they neared his ranch, Luke finally spoke. "You can stay another night. Take time to think things through." Clara wanted to refuse. Pride demanded it. But practicality won. "I'll pay for my keep. I can cook, clean, mend. Kitchen could use a woman's touch," he admitted. "And there's the garden plot. Never could get anything to grow proper." They were negotiating, she realized. Not charity, but a bargain. Work for shelter. It wasn't what she'd dreamed, but it was better than Mrs. Holcomb's calculating eyes or the empty road back to nowhere. "Just until I find something permanent," she said. "Understood." But as they pulled into the ranch yard and she saw the kitchen window glowing warm in the late afternoon light, Clara wondered if either of them truly believed that. Sometimes. She was learning. Permanent was just another word for whatever lasted until tomorrow came. The next morning dawned clear and merciless, the kind of day that showed every flaw and false hope in sharp relief. Clara stood on Luke's porch, watching him ready the wagon for another trip to town. She'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with her options, and they all led to the same bitter conclusion. She needed work. Any work, even if it meant swallowing what remained of her pride. "Try the hotel," Luke suggested as he checked the harness. "Sometimes they need help with the dining room, and there's the Widow Martinez, takes in sewing." Clara nodded, though they both knew she was running out of respectable options. She dressed in her plainest frock, a brown calico that had seen better days, hoping to look less like abandoned mail-order bride and more like a woman seeking honest employment. The ride to town felt shorter this time, or perhaps she was just dreading it less. Luke kept up a steady commentary about the land, the weather, the habits of cattle, meaningless talk that somehow made the journey easier. She found herself noting the way he handled the reins, gentle but firm. and how he automatically helped her down from the wagon without making a show of it. "I'll be at the blacksmith's," he said. "Take whatever time you need." The hotel was a 2-story affair that had seen grander days. The proprietor, a German named Schultz, barely looked up from his ledger. "No work," he said in heavily accented English. "Maybe try Austin." Austin, 200 miles away, might as well be the moon for all the good it did her. The widow Martinez lived in a small adobe house on the Mexican side of town. She answered Clara's knock with suspicious eyes, taking in the Eastern dress and soft hands. "You sew?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me." The widow brought out a torn shirt. "Show me." Clara's fingers fumbled with the unfamiliar weight of the rough cloth, but muscle memory took over. Tiny, even stitches, almost invisible when finished. The widow grunted, which might have been approval. 3 shirts a week, 10 cents each. You provide thread. 30 cents a week. Clara's mind calculated rapidly. Thread would cost at least 5 cents. 25 cents wouldn't buy a meal at the hotel, much less lodging. I'll need to think about it." The widow shrugged and shut the door. Clara stood in the dusty street, feeling the weight of curious stares from windows and doorways. A group of cowboys lounged outside the saloon, and one of them said something that made the others laugh. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, but her cheeks burned. There was one more possibility, one she'd avoided even thinking about. The Golden Dollar Saloon needed girls to serve drinks and provide companionship to lonely men. She'd seen the women in their bright dresses and painted faces, seen how the town's respectable folk crossed the street to avoid them, but they had rooms above the saloon, food, and protection of a sort. Clara found herself standing outside the batwing doors, listening to the piano and rough laughter within. Through the gap, she could see a girl not much older than herself carrying a tray of glasses, dodging the grab of a drunk miner. The girl's smile never wavered, painted bright as her lips. "You lost, honey?" Clara spun around. A woman stood behind her, older and harder, with shrewd eyes that had seen too much. I heard you might have work." The woman, surely the madam, looked her over like a horse at auction. "You're that mail-order bride Sam Morrison left high and dry." Heat flooded Clara's face, but she held the woman's gaze. "I need work." "Work." The madam's laugh was humorless. "That's one word for it. You know what kind of work we do here?" "I can serve drinks. Clean. I don't—" Clara's voice faltered. "Don't what? Don't plan on doing what it takes to survive?" The madam's voice softened slightly. "Look, honey, you seem like a nice girl." "But nice don't pay the bills out here. You come work for me. You do all the work, understand? No picking and choosing." Clara's stomach churned. She understood. Oh, she understood perfectly. "I need to think." "Sure, you think." The madam was already turning away. "When you're done thinking and your stomach's empty enough, you come see Ruby. I'll still be here." Clara fled, walking blindly until she found herself at the edge of town where the cemetery began. She sank onto a wooden bench someone had placed beneath a scraggly oak, her whole body shaking. Is this what became of women alone in the West? A choice between starvation and selling the only thing they had left to sell? Miss Whitfield? She looked up to find the minister's wife, Mrs. Dawson, standing before her with a concerned expression. Clara had met her briefly the day before when she'd inquired at the parsonage about work. "Are you quite well?" "Yes, Clara straightened, summoning a smile from somewhere. "Just resting a moment." Mrs. Dawson sat beside her uninvited. "Forgive my presumption, but I heard about your circumstances. It's shameful. What Mr. Morrison did." Clara said nothing. What was there to say? "I wish we could offer employment, but the church can barely support my husband and myself." Mrs. Dawson twisted her gloves in her lap. "Have you considered, that is, Mr. Hammond seems a respectable man? Mr. Hammond has been very kind." Clara said carefully. "Yes, Mrs." Dawson leaned closer, lowering her voice. Perhaps kinder than mere Christian charity requires. A woman in your position, well, sometimes arrangements can be made for mutual benefit. Clara stared at her. The minister's wife was suggesting, what? That she become Luke's mistress, his housekeeper with benefits unspoken but understood. I should go, Clara said, standing abruptly. Mr. Hammond will be waiting. Mrs. Dawson caught her sleeve. Think on it, dear. It's not ideal, but it's better than the alternatives. And who knows? Sometimes these arrangements lead to proper marriages. Frontier life requires flexibility. Clara pulled free and walked away on unsteady legs. The whole town, it seemed, was determined to slot her into one role or another. Fallen woman, kept woman, desperate woman. But what other choices did she have? She found Luke at the blacksmith's, watching as a new shoe was fitted to his horse. He took one look at her face and gathered the reins without comment. They were halfway home before he spoke. No luck? The widow Martinez offered piecework, 25 cents a week after expenses. Luke whistled low. Can't live on that. No. Clara stared at the road ahead. The saloon was hiring. His hands tightened on the reins, but his voice stayed even. That's no place for you. I may not have the luxury of being particular. There's always choices. Are there? The words came out sharper than she intended. Because from where I sit, Mr. Hammond, the choices seem to be starve slowly or degrade myself quickly. Unless... She stopped, but he heard the unspoken words. Unless I accept your charity indefinitely. Unless I become what Mrs. Dawson suggested. Unless I trade one kind of dependence for another. You can stay as long as you need, he said quietly. Work for your keep. Like we discussed, it's honest work, nothing more. Nothing more. Clara heard the promise in those words, the line he was drawing. She should be relieved. She was relieved. So why did some small, treacherous part of her feel disappointed? The ranch appeared before them, solid and welcoming in the afternoon light. As Luke helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered just a moment on her waist. Their eyes met, and Clara saw something there. Not pity or calculation, but a loneliness that matched her own. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For not being like other men. His smile was rueful. Don't know if that's a compliment or not. That night, Clara lay in bed tallying her choices like a miser counting coins. The widow's sewing would kill her slowly, penny by penny. The saloon would kill her faster, in spirit if not in body. The minister's wife's suggestion. She turned her face to the wall. Luke Hammond was a good man. He deserved better than a woman who came to him out of desperation. And she deserved better than to be anybody's convenient arrangement. But the frontier had a way of adjusting what people deserved to what they could live with. And as she listened to Luke moving quietly in the kitchen, banking the fire and setting things to rights for morning, Clara wondered if learning to live with less than you deserved was just another word for growing up. Tomorrow she would try again. The laundry, perhaps, or the boarding house kitchen. She would not give up. But tonight, in this borrowed room, in a kind man's house, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of how far she'd fallen from the girl who'd stepped onto that stagecoach with a heart full of hope. That girl was gone now. Lost somewhere on the road between independence and this moment. What remained was a woman learning the hard truth of the frontier. Sometimes survival meant accepting help, even when it bruised your pride. Sometimes it meant working for your keep in a stranger's house and being grateful for the chance. And sometimes, Clara thought as sleep finally claimed her, it meant acknowledging that the kindness of a good man might be worth more than all the independence in the world. A week passed, then 2, and somehow Clara found herself settling into the rhythms of Luke's ranch like water finding its level. She rose with the rooster, made coffee strong enough to float horseshoes, the way Luke preferred it, and had breakfast on the table by the time he came in from checking the stock. The work was hard but honest, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, tending the kitchen garden that had indeed been sadly neglected. Never could get the tomatoes to take, Luke admitted one morning, watching her coax water from the pump to the struggling plants. Kept forgetting to water them regular. They need consistency, Clara said, on her knees in the dirt. Like most growing things, she'd traded her fine dresses for a simple work skirt and shirtwaist, purchased with the coin from selling her mother's earrings. The sacrifice had stung, but less than she'd expected. What use were garnets when you needed sturdy boots and a sunbonnet? The chickens became her particular charge. Luke's previous efforts at chicken keeping had been haphazard at best. The coop was sturdy but filthy, and the hens had gone half wild, laying eggs in hidden nests throughout the yard. Clara spent 3 days cleaning and organizing, coaxing the birds back with feed and patience. "You've got away with them," Luke observed, finding her surrounded by peacefully clucking hens one afternoon. "They just want to know what to expect," Clara replied, scattering grain in steady arcs. "Routine makes them feel safe." She could have been talking about herself. Each day's predictable pattern: coffee, breakfast, chores, dinner, mending by lamplight, wrapped around her like armor against the uncertainty beyond the ranch boundaries. Here, she knew her purpose. Here, she was needed. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, but for Frank Collier, he rode in on a Thursday afternoon, tall and lean with the kind of smile that had probably charmed many a woman. Luke was out checking the far pasture, leaving Clara alone when the stranger appeared. "Afternoon, ma'am." He swept off his hat, revealing sandy hair and dancing eyes. "Frank Collier, I'm looking for Luke Hammond. He's out working, expected back for supper." Clara kept her distance, dish towel in hand. Something about the man's easy manner put her on edge. "Well now, that's a shame." Frank's gaze traveled over her, noting the absence of a ring. "I don't believe we've met, Mrs. Hammond? Miss Whitfield? I keep house for Mr. Hammond." "Keep house." His smile widened. "That what they're calling it these days?" Heat flooded Clara's face. "If you'd like to wait for Mr. Hammond, you're welcome to water your horse. Otherwise, no offense meant, miss." But his grin suggested otherwise. Luke always was a lucky fellow. Didn't know he'd gotten this lucky. Clara turned on her heel and went inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. Through the window, she watched Frank help himself to water from the trough, taking his time, clearly hoping for another glimpse of her. She stayed out of sight until she heard Luke's horse approaching. The men's greeting was cordial enough. They'd known each other since boyhood. She gathered, but Luke's expression hardened when Frank made some comment too low for her to hear. They talked business for a few minutes, something about cattle prices and a drive to Kansas. Then Frank mounted up. "You take care, Luke," he called, loud enough for Clara to hear. "And give my regards to your housekeeper." Luke came inside, his face like thunder. Clara had dinner ready, venison stew and fresh bread, but he barely touched it. "I'm sorry if Mr. Collier was inappropriate," she ventured. "Frank's got a mouth on him." Luke pushed his plate away. "Always has." He seemed to think. Clara stopped, unsure how to continue. "I know what he thinks." Luke's chair scraped as he stood. "Half the county probably thinks it by now." The unfairness of it burned in Clara's chest. "I've done nothing improper. We've done nothing. Doesn't matter. Woman living in a man's house, no ring on her finger, no family connection." He ran a hand through his hair. "I should have thought. Should have known this would happen." "Are you asking me to leave?" The question hung between them like a blade. Luke turned from the window where he'd been staring out at nothing. "No. Last thing I want is—" He stopped, started again. "You've made a difference here. The house, the chickens, the garden. Hell, even the coffee tastes better. Despite everything." Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. "That's because I clean the pot properly. That's because you care whether it's done right." His expression softened. "I won't have you driven out by gossip, but you should know what people are saying, what they'll keep saying." Clara lifted her chin. "Let them talk. I know the truth." "You know it. God knows it. Simple as that." It has to be. She began clearing the table, needing the familiar task. Unless you have a better solution. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, there is one way to stop the talk. Her hands stilled on the dishes. Oh? We could make it true. The Mrs. Hammond part. I mean, he said it to the floor, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Not a real, that is, a business arrangement. Legal protection for you, respectability. I'd not expect, wouldn't ask for anything you weren't willing to give. Clara carefully set down the plate she was holding, afraid she might drop it. You're proposing marriage? I'm proposing a solution. He finally met her eyes. I know it's not what you came out here for, not some grand romance with flowers and promises, but it'd be honest, safer than you going back to town looking for work that isn't there. She thought of Frank Collier's knowing smile, of Mrs. Dawson's suggestions, of Ruby at the saloon. Then she looked at Luke, solid, steady Luke who'd taken her in without questions, who kept his word and worked from dawn to dusk without complaint, who was offering her his name as protection, not possession. I need to think, she managed. Course you do. Take all the time you need. He grabbed his hat. I'll be in the barn. Clara finished the dishes mechanically, her mind churning. It wasn't the proposal she'd dreamed of as a girl. No declaration of love, no promise of devotion. Just a practical arrangement between two people caught by circumstance. But then, Samuel Morrison had written beautiful words about love and devotion. And where had that gotten her? She found Luke in the barn, mending harness by lantern light. He looked up when she entered but didn't speak. Would it be a real marriage? She asked without preamble. In all ways. His hand stilled on the leather. That'd be up to you. I'm not a man to take what isn't offered freely. And if it's never offered, then I'll have gained a partner who makes fine coffee and keeps the chickens in line. Seems like a fair trade. Despite everything. She laughed, a small sound, but real. You're a strange man. Luke Hammond. Been told that before. Clara studied him in the lantern light, the patient hands, the steady gaze, the quiet strength that asked for nothing but offered everything. Not the husband she'd imagined, but perhaps the one she needed. I'll want my own room still, she said, at least at first. Of course. And I'll keep working. The house, the garden. I won't be a burden. Never thought you would be. Then yes. The words came out steadier than she felt. Yes, I'll marry you. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. He stood, extending his hand as if sealing a business deal. After a moment's hesitation, Clara took it. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but gentle. We'll go to town tomorrow, he said. See the minister, unless you'd prefer to wait? No. Clara squared her shoulders. Best to have it done before I lose my nerve. That night, she lay in her narrow bed, soon to be truly hers by right, and wondered at the strange turns life took. She'd left independence as one man's intended bride and would become another's wife, all in the space of 3 weeks. Not the love story she'd imagined, but perhaps something more valuable, a partnership built on respect and necessity, with room to grow into whatever it might become. The morning would bring a new name, a new status, a new kind of belonging. Clara Whitfield would disappear, and Mrs. Luke Hammond would take her place, not the romantic ending she'd dreamed of, but a practical beginning that just might lead somewhere worth going. The wedding had been 3 months past, a simple affair with only the minister's wife and the blacksmith as witnesses. Clara wore her navy traveling dress, cleaned and pressed, while Luke had donned his Sunday shirt. No flowers, no music, just vows spoken plain and a kiss so brief it might have been imagined. But the ring on her finger was real enough, a simple band Luke's mother had worn, and the name Mrs. Hammond carried weight in town now. The gossip had died as Luke predicted, replaced by speculation about when babies might appear. Clara ignored the knowing looks and focused on building the life she'd stumbled into. The garden flourished under her care. rows of beans and squash and the stubborn tomatoes finally yielding fruit. The house had acquired small touches, curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, wild flowers in a mason jar, a rag rug by the bed. They'd settled into patterns of courtesy, dancing around each other with careful respect. Luke still knocked before entering the house if he'd been working. Clara still kept to her own room at night, but sometimes their hands brushed passing dishes, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as before. "Thought I'd teach you to ride proper," Luke announced one Saturday morning. "Can't have a rancher's wife who can't sit a horse." Clara looked up from kneading bread dough. "I can ride. Side saddle, maybe. That won't help if you need to ride for real. Check fences. Bring in stock." He was already heading for the door. "Come on. Morning's wasting." She wanted to protest. The bread needed rising. The floors wanted scrubbing. But something in his manner stopped her. Luke rarely asked for anything beyond meals and mended shirts. If he wanted to teach her riding, there was likely a reason. The horse he'd chosen was Buttercup, a gentle mare with a disposition to match her name. Clara had fed her apples and sugar lumps but never attempted to ride her. Now Luke let her out, already saddled with worn leather that had shaped itself to countless riders. "First thing," he said, "forget everything you learned about riding pretty. Out here, you ride practical." He showed her how to mount from the left, swing her leg over despite her skirts, find her balance in the unfamiliar position. Clara felt exposed and graceless, but Luke's steady presence beside the horse kept her nerves in check. "Back straight, hands light on the reins. She knows her business. Don't need to haul on her mouth." They started with walking circles in the corral, Luke calling corrections. "Heels down. Look where you're going. Not at her ears. That's it." After an hour, Clara's legs ached and her back protested, but she'd progressed to a gentle trot without clutching the saddle horn in terror. Luke's rare smile when she completed a full circuit without bouncing like a sack of grain was worth the discomfort. "You'll do," he said, helping her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist, steadying her when her legs wobbled. "We'll work up to a canter once you're comfortable." "Why now?" Clara asked, working feeling back into her fingers. "Why do I need to learn?" Luke's expression shuddered slightly. "Ranch life's unpredictable. Might need you to ride for help someday, or move cattle if I'm laid up. Best to be prepared." There was more to it. She sensed, but didn't press. Luke revealed things in his own time, like water seeping through stone. The riding lessons continued twice a week. Clara's initial awkwardness gave way to growing confidence as she learned to move with the horse instead of fighting it. Luke was a patient teacher, demonstrating techniques with an economy of motion that spoke of years in the saddle. The moment that changed things came on a blustery Tuesday. They'd ridden out to check the creek, Clara on Buttercup, Luke on his rangy gelding. The sky threatened rain, and Luke wanted to ensure the cattle had access to water before any storm hit. They were returning home when Buttercup spooked at a rattlesnake sunning on a rock. The mare shied violently sideways, and Clara, caught off guard, felt herself sliding. The ground rushed up, promising pain, when strong arms caught her, hauling her against a solid chest. Luke had dismounted in one fluid motion, reaching her before she could fall. For a moment, they stood frozen, Clara's hands clutching his shoulders, his arms tight around her waist. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid as her own, smell the leather and sweat and something uniquely him. "You hurt?" His voice was rough. No. But she didn't step away, and neither did he. The wind whipped loose strands of hair across her face. Luke raised one hand, tucking them behind her ear with surprising gentleness. His fingers lingered against her cheek, calloused but careful. "Clara." Just her name, but weighted with questions. She lifted her face, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like their wedding day's brief touch. This was searching, careful, a question asked and answered without words. Clara's hands slid from his shoulders to curve around his neck, and she felt more than heard his soft groan. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, Luke rested his forehead against hers. Been wanting to do that for weeks. Only weeks? The words surprised her. Teasing wasn't something she'd done since before. His smile was crooked. Maybe longer, since you told that rooster who was boss, if I'm honest. Clara laughed, the sound startling them both. When had she last laughed freely, without calculation or bitterness? We should get back, Luke said, though he didn't release her. Storm's coming? They rode home through rising wind, but the silence between them had changed, charged now with possibility instead of careful distance. In the barn, they worked together unsaddling the horses, brushing them down, movements synchronized without need for speech. The rain started as they reached the house, fat drops that quickly became sheets of water. They stood on the porch, watching it fall, shoulders barely touching. Things will be different now. Clara said, it wasn't a question. Different how is up to us. Luke turned to face her fully. I meant what I said before. I won't ask for anything you're not ready to give. A kiss doesn't change that. But it had changed things, and they both knew it. The careful walls they'd built were cracked now, letting light through. That evening, as Clara served dinner, she was acutely aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. The kiss hung between them like a presence at the table. When Luke thanked her for the meal, his fingers brushed hers on the plate, and this time the contact was deliberate. After dishes, instead of retreating to the barn, Luke settled in his chair with a week-old newspaper. Clara took up her mending, working by lamplight. The rain drummed on the roof, sealing them in together. My father taught me to ride when I was 6. Clara said suddenly, Side saddle, of course. Said a lady should glide like a swan, not bounce like a potato sack. Luke lowered his paper. What happened to him? Fever, 5 years back. Mother followed within the month. She kept her eyes on her needle. They'd have been horrified to see me now, married to a stranger, working like hired help. You're not hired help, you're my wife. The possession in those words should have rankled. Instead, warmth bloomed in her chest. A wife in name, she reminded him. For now. He returned to his paper, but she caught his small smile. Clara bent back to her sewing, hiding her own smile. For now. 2 words that held promise instead of limitation. Outside, the storm raged. But inside the small house, something new was taking root, fragile as seedlings, but reaching toward the light all the same. The riding lessons continued, but now Luke's touches lingered when he helped her mount and dismount. Now Clara let her hand rest on his shoulder longer than necessary for balance. They were courting, she realized with some wonder. Courting after marriage, backwards as everything else in her upended life. But perhaps that was fitting for the frontier, where conventional rules bent before necessity, where a mail-order bride could become a rancher's wife, and a marriage of convenience could grow into something neither of them had dared to hope for when they spoke those hasty vows. The future stretched before them, uncertain as ever but no longer quite so fearsome. Clara was learning to ride, learning the land, learning the man she'd married, and Luke, patient, steady Luke, was learning too. Learning to smile more readily, to share his thoughts over dinner, to see his house as a home. They were building something together, day by careful day, and if it wasn't the romance she'd once dreamed of, it was perhaps something better, a partnership grounded in respect, sparked by attraction, and growing toward love. The land surveyor arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, his black suit and Eastern manner as out of place as a peacock in a hen house. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Luke met him in the yard, saw the way her husband's shoulders tensed as he read the official-looking documents. Mrs. Hammond? The surveyor had made his way to the porch while Luke studied the papers. Theodore Blackwood, from the General Land Office. I'll need to verify residence and improvements for the claim filing. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, unease prickling her spine. Of course. Would you care for coffee? That's kind, ma'am, but I need to complete my survey. His eyes traveled over the house, the garden, the well-maintained outbuildings. How long have you and Mr. Hammond been in residence? We've been married 4 months. And before that, Luke appeared at her shoulder. Before that's no concern of the government's. We're here now, legal and proper. Blackwood made a note in his ledger. The law requires continuous residence and improvement for 5 years. Your initial filing was 3 years ago. Mr. Hammond. Any gaps in occupation could invalidate the claim. Clara felt Luke stiffen beside her. 3 years ago, he'd been alone, struggling to prove up the land with no help. The months he'd spent nursing his father through his final illness, leaving the ranch empty. Would that count against him? I've worked this land every season, Luke said evenly. Built every fence post, dug every irrigation ditch. I don't doubt it. Blackwood's smile was thin. But the law is specific. I'll need to verify continuous occupation. Perhaps your wife could confirm your presence here during the period in question. Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't known Luke 4 months ago, much less 3 years. To lie to a federal official. My wife wasn't here then, Luke said. But my improvements speak for themselves. This place was nothing but grass and sky when I started. Indeed. Blackwood made another note. I'll need to examine the property boundaries. There's been some question about the eastern section, whether it properly belongs to this claim or the Morrison property. Morrison. The name hit Clara like cold water. Samuel's abandoned ranch butted up against Luke's eastern pasture. Prime grazing land with access to Mustang Creek. Morrison abandoned his claim, Luke said flatly. Hasn't been back in months. 6 months' absence voids a claim. True, but it's only been 4 months since Mr. Morrison's departure. His claim remains valid for another 60 days. Blackwood consulted his papers. Unless, of course, someone were to purchase his interest. The back taxes alone would be substantial, but for adjoining property, he let the suggestion hang. Clara saw the calculation in Luke's face. The eastern pasture would double his water access, secure the ranch's future, but the cost, I'll think on it, Luke said, after Blackwood left, promising to return in a week for his final report. Luke slumped against the porch rail. Clara had rarely seen him look defeated. How bad is it? She asked quietly. Bad enough. He scrubbed a hand over his face. If he finds fault with the occupation requirement, I could lose everything. And Morrison's land, I need that water access, but the taxes would clean me out, unless... He stopped, jaw tightening. Unless what? Nothing, just fool thoughts. He straightened, summoning a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Don't worry on it, I'll figure something. But Clara did worry, through dinner and evening chores, through the mending that usually calmed her mind. Luke was quieter than usual, the weight of potentially losing the ranch settling over him like a shroud. When he bid her good night and headed to his room, they still kept separate rooms despite the growing warmth between them. His shoulders carried a bend she'd never seen before. Clara lay wakeful, turning the problem over, the taxes on Morrison's land, the threat to Luke's claim. It all came down to money they didn't have, unless... She rose and lit a candle, crossing to her trunk. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, lay her mother's Bible. But it wasn't scripture she sought. Behind the back cover, secured with paste, hid the last of her securities, 5 $20 gold pieces, her final emergency fund, $100, kept against disaster. This qualified as disaster, didn't it, before she could lose her nerve? Clara knocked softly on Luke's door. Luke, are you awake? Rustling, then his voice, careful. Come in. He sat on the bed's edge, fully dressed save for boots. The candlelight caught the worry lines around his eyes, making him look older than his years. I have something. Clara held out the gold pieces, watching his face change from confusion to understanding to something like pain. Clara, no. It's not enough for all the taxes, but maybe a down payment to show good faith. I can't take your money. Our money. She moved closer, pressing the coins into his reluctant hand. What's mine is yours. Isn't that what the minister said? That's different. This is your security. My what? Escape fund? Running money? She sat beside him, careful to leave proper distance. I'm not running. Luke, this is my home now. Our home. And I won't let some government man take it because of missing paperwork. Luke stared at the gold pieces, then at her. Why? Such a simple question, requiring complicated answers. Because you took me in when I had nowhere else to go. Because you've never asked for more than I could give. Because somewhere between that first bowl of beans and teaching me to ride, I stopped thinking of this as temporary. Because that's what partners do, she said instead. His free hand covered hers, warm and calloused. Partners. Unless you'd prefer to handle it alone, I understand if... He silenced her with a kiss, different from their first, deeper, surer, carrying gratitude and something stronger. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Thank you. We'll need more, Clara said, practical even as her heart raced. The mortgage payment's due next month, and if we buy Morrison's land... I know. Luke's thumb traced circles on her palm. Frank Collier's organizing a cattle drive to Kansas. Wants me to contribute 20 head, help drive them. The profit would cover everything, but it means being gone 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Clara's chest tightened at the thought, but she kept her voice steady. When? 2 weeks. I wouldn't go, but we need the money. She squeezed his hand. I can manage the ranch. You've never... He stopped, reconsidered. You've learned fast, and the Jeffersons would help if needed. They sat in the candlelight, hands linked, planning. Which cattle to drive? What repairs couldn't wait? How to manage the daily work alone? Practical talk that somehow felt more intimate than kisses, building their future word by word. I should go, Clara said finally, though she didn't move. Should you? Luke's voice was rough. We're married, Clara, legal and proper, like I told Blackwood. Her breath caught. Luke, I'm not pushing, just saying you don't have to go if you don't want to. He lifted their joined hands, kissed her knuckles. Partner! Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. 4 months of careful distance, of separate rooms and tentative touches, but sitting here planning their survival, she felt more married than she had standing before the minister. Not tonight, she said softly. When you come back from Kansas, when we know the ranch is safe, something to come home to. He murmured, yes. This kiss was promise and pledge, sealing more than any paper could. When Clara finally returned to her room, she no longer felt like a guest in Luke's house. She felt like what she was, a rancher's wife, fighting beside her husband to save their land. The next morning, Luke rode to town with her gold and his determination. He returned with papers, a partial payment on Morrison's taxes, an agreement with the land office, and a contract for the cattle drive. Blackwood wasn't pleased. He reported over dinner, but he accepted the occupation proof, especially with you here now as evidence of domestic establishment. Clara laughed at his imitation of the surveyor's pompous tone. Glad to be useful as domestic evidence. You're more than that. Luke's expression grew serious. You know that, right? This place, it was just existence before. Now it's living. She reached across the table, covered his hand with hers. For me too. They had 2 weeks before he left. 2 weeks to prepare both ranch and hearts for separation. But they were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. They were partners, united by choice and growing affection, ready to face whatever the frontier demanded. The government could measure land and count improvements, but they couldn't quantify what Luke and Clara were building. A marriage as solid as the house that sheltered them, rooted deep in mutual respect and blooming with unexpected love. The morning Luke left for Kansas, frost silvered the grass despite the calendar claiming early October. Clara stood on the porch, arms wrapped tight around herself, watching him make final preparations. 20 head of cattle milled in the holding pen, ready to join Collier's larger herd. Luke's saddlebags bulged with provisions, his rifle cleaned and ready. Water the garden morning and evening, he said for the third time. The gray mare's got a stone bruise. Keep her in the small corral. If that coyote comes sniffing around the chickens again, I'll handle it. Clara stepped down from the porch, unable to maintain distance any longer. I've got the Winchester and Mrs. Jefferson promised to check in twice a week. Luke nodded, but worry creased his brow. 6 weeks suddenly seemed an eternity to leave her alone. This woman who'd been a stranger mere months ago. Clara, if something happens, nothing will happen. She reached up, smoothed the worry lines with gentle fingers. Go earn our future. I'll keep our present safe. He caught her hand, pressed it to his cheek. They'd grown easier with touches these past 2 weeks, but still maintained the boundaries she'd set. When he returned, that would be time enough for the rest. Our future, he repeated softly. The sound of horses announced Frank Collier's arrival with 2 other riders. Clara stepped back, propriety reasserting itself in company. But Luke caught her hand, squeezed it once, hard. 6 weeks, he promised. I'll be counting. He swung into the saddle with the easy grace she'd come to admire, touched his hat brim, and rode out without looking back. Clara understood. Sometimes looking back made leaving impossible. She watched until the dust settled, until the lowing of cattle faded, until she stood alone in the morning silence. Then she went inside and got to work. The first week passed in a blur of activity. Clara threw herself into tasks, from dawn to past dusk, falling into bed too exhausted for the lonely thoughts that crept in with darkness. She mucked stalls, mended fences where the cattle had pushed through, harvested the last of the garden before frost could claim it. The neighbors, true to their word, appeared regularly. Mrs. Jefferson, a comfortable woman with 6 children and endless energy, brought fresh bread and gossip in equal measure. That Eastern dandy's been sniffing around the Morrison place, she reported, settling her bulk at Clara's kitchen table. Blackwood, his name was, asking questions about boundaries and water rights. Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Luke paid the taxes. We have the receipt. Law's one thing, politics another. Mrs. Jefferson's keen eyes studied her. You managing all right out here? It's a lot for a woman alone. I'm not alone. My husband will be back soon. Course he will. The older woman patted her hand. Just remember, you need anything, you holler, day or night. After she left, Clara stood in the yard, surveying her domain. The ranch looked tidy, cared for, but for how long? Without Luke's strength for the heavy work, things would gradually slide. Already the woodpile looked meager against coming winter, and the barn door hung slightly crooked where a hinge had loosened. But she hadn't come this far to be defeated by loose hinges and firewood. Clara fetched Luke's toolbox, spent an hour wrestling with the barn door until it hung true. The satisfaction of that simple repair sparked something in her, if she could fix a door. What else might she manage? The second week brought challenges. The coyote Luke had warned about grew bold, circling the chicken coop at dusk. Clara sat up 3 nights running with the rifle, waiting, when it finally showed itself. Slinking through the shadows. She forced herself steady, sighted careful, squeezed the trigger as Luke had taught her. The shot echoed across the empty land. The coyote yelped and fled, leaving blood spots on the ground. Not a killing shot, but enough to teach caution. Clara's hands shook as she lowered the rifle, but pride steadied them. She'd protected what was hers. Days took on rhythm. Morning chores, noon meal, afternoon repairs, evening tending. She learned to chop wood in smaller pieces she could manage, to coax the temperamental pump when it stuck, to read weather in cloud formations and wind shifts. Her hands grew rougher, her arms stronger, her confidence deeper. The third week, Tom Jefferson appeared with his oldest boy to help with heavier tasks, splitting a real wood pile, checking the roof before winter, reinforcing the chicken coop. Clara tried to pay them, but Tom waved her off. Luke would do the same for us, he said simply. That's how it works out here. While they worked, Clara baked bread, pie, cookies to send home with them. It felt good to contribute something beyond need, to be neighbor rather than burden. Evenings were hardest, with work done and darkness pressing close. The empty chair across from hers loomed large. She took to reading aloud from Luke's small library, agricultural pamphlets, a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, even the almanac, just to hear a voice in the silence. One night, exploring the shelf more thoroughly, she found a packet of letters tied with string, hidden behind the books. The handwriting was feminine, the paper yellowed with age. Clara hesitated, then carefully returned them unread. Everyone deserved their private sorrows. The fourth week brought the first real cold snap. Clara woke to find ice in the wash basin and frost etching fantasies on the windows. The horse's breath clouded in the barn, and the chickens huddled together for warmth. She doubled their feed and spent precious firewood keeping the kitchen warm enough for bread to rise. That afternoon, working to insulate the chicken coop with straw, she heard horses approaching. Her heart leaped. Too early for Luke, but maybe news. She grabbed the rifle, just in case, and stepped into the yard. Theodore Blackwood sat his hired horse like a sack of grain, accompanied by a man she didn't recognize, younger, sharper, with calculating eyes. Mrs. Hammond. Blackwood touched his hat mockingly. "Is your husband about?" "He's away on business, expected back soon." She kept the rifle casual but visible. "Indeed. How convenient." The younger man spoke with an Eastern accent that grated, "I'm James Morrison, Samuel's cousin. I've come to claim my inheritance." Clara's blood chilled. "Samuel abandoned the property. We've paid the taxes." "Partially paid," Morrison corrected. "An abandonment must be proven in court. I've filed a challenge to your claim on the Eastern section, asserting prior rights through my cousin's estate. You can't, I can and have." He produced a document with official seals. "Court date is set for 3 weeks hence. Your husband will need to appear to defend his claim. If he fails to appear..." His smile was thin as winter ice. "Well, default judgments favor the plaintiff. 3 weeks. Luke wouldn't be back for 2 more at minimum, and that assumed no delays." Clara gripped the rifle tighter, mind racing. "We'll be there," she said with more confidence than she felt. After they left, she sank onto the porch steps, document crumpled in her fist. Everything they'd worked for, threatened by a cousin crawling out of the woodwork to claim land he'd never worked, never bled for, never loved, but she wouldn't let them take it. Not the eastern pasture with its precious water access, not the future she and Luke were building together. Clara smoothed the summons, read it through carefully. Legal language designed to confuse, but the meaning was clear enough: appear or lose. That night she wrote to Luke, care of the cattle buyer in Kansas, praying the letter would find him in time. Then she wrote to Mrs. Dawson, the minister's wife who'd first suggested she consider Luke's protection. If anyone knew the town's legal resources, it would be the minister's wife. The 5th week blurred between regular chores and frantic preparation. Clara gathered every scrap of paper related to the land: Luke's original claim, tax receipts, improvement records. She rode the boundaries herself, noting every fence post, every irrigation ditch, every sign of the sweat Luke had poured into the land. Mrs. Dawson proved invaluable, introducing her to Josiah Winters, an old lawyer who'd retired to the territory for his health but still kept his hand in. "Possession is 9/10 of the law," he wheezed, reviewing her documents. "You've maintained the property, improved it, paid taxes, but this cousin has blood claim, and Judge Harper sets store by such things. What can we do? Delay, if possible. Fight, if necessary. Your presence helps. A married couple establishing a homestead carries more weight than a bachelor's claim, but your husband really should be here." Clara left his dusty office with determination hardening her spine. Luke would return when he could. Until then, she'd hold the fort, literally if necessary. The night before the 6th week began, she couldn't sleep. Tomorrow Luke might return, or next week, or never if something had gone wrong on the trail. The coyote was back. She could hear it calling in the distance, and answering cries suggested it had found a mate. Clara rose, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table where so many quiet meals had built the foundation of her marriage. On impulse, she began to write. My dear Luke, if you return to find me gone to town, know that I have gone to fight for our land. The eastern pasture that waters our dreams will not be stolen by paper and lies while I draw breath. I am your wife-in-law and in spirit, and I will defend what is ours as you would do. The ranch is well. The chickens miss your morning talks, though they've finally accepted my authority. The gray mare's hoof has healed. The garden is put to bed for winter. Our home waits for your return, as do I. Ever your devoted, Clara. She left the letter on the table, waited with the salt cellar. Then she banked the fire, checked the stock one last time, and returned to bed to wait for dawn. Whether Luke returned tomorrow or next week, whether they faced the court date together or she stood alone. Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that this land was theirs. They'd claimed it not just with papers and payments, but with sweat and determination, with partnership forged in necessity and strengthened by growing love. Let Morrison come with his cousin's blood and Eastern lawyers. She'd meet them with Western steel and the fierce protection of a woman defending her home. The ranch would be here when Luke returned, and so would she, his wife, his partner, his match in all the ways that mattered. The coyote called again, distant now, and Clara smiled in the darkness. Even predators knew when they faced a guardian too fierce to challenge. Tomorrow would bring its battles. But tonight she rested secure in the knowledge that she'd become what Luke had seen in her from the start, a woman strong enough for the frontier, for partnership, for love. The courthouse bell tolled 9 times as Clara climbed the steps, her best dress pressed and her documentation clutched in gloved hands. 2 days until the hearing, and still no word from Luke. She'd made this trip to file additional papers, to meet once more with Josiah Winters, to do anything but wait helplessly at the ranch. Mrs. Hammond. She turned to find Frank Collier dismounting at the hitching post, dusty and grinning. Her heart leaped. Frank, the drive. Is Luke? Right behind me. Maybe half a day. Sent me ahead to let you know. His grin widened. Made good money. 2, your husband drives a hard bargain. Relief weakened her knees. He's well. Ornery as ever. Wouldn't barely stop to rest, knowing you were here alone. Frank's expression grew serious. Heard about Morrison's cousin. That's a snake's trick, waiting till Luke was gone. We'll handle it. Clara stood straighter. With Luke here for the hearing? About that. Frank shifted uncomfortably. There was some trouble in Kansas. Nothing serious, he added quickly, seeing her face. But Luke took a horse's kick to the ribs. He's riding, but slow. Might be another 2, 3 days. The hearing was in 2 days. Clara forced her voice steady. I see. I'll testify if needed. Known Luke since we were boys. That land's his by rights. Thank you. She managed a smile. I should prepare. But as she turned away, Frank called after her. He talked about you, around the campfire. Never seen Luke talk so much about anything, let alone a woman. Heat touched her cheeks. Did he? Said you could make flowers grow in pure stubbornness and face down a coyote without blinking. Frank's grin returned. Said he was the luckiest fool in Texas, even if you did make him clean the coffee pot proper. Clara laughed despite everything. Tell him to hurry home. His coffee pot misses him. She spent the rest of the day with Winters, preparing arguments, reviewing precedents. The old lawyer grew more pessimistic with each hour. Judge Harper favors family connections, he muttered. And this Morrison brought a fancy lawyer from Austin, without Luke here to testify about his improvements. Then I'll testify. Women's testimony carries less weight, especially about property matters. Then we'll make it carry enough. The next day crawled past. Clara haunted the edge of town, watching for dust clouds that might signal Luke's arrival. Nothing. That evening, she made her decision. The morning of the hearing dawned bright and merciless. Clara dressed with care, not her best dress, which marked her as trying too hard, but her serviceable brown calico. the one she'd worn that first day seeking work. She pinned her hair severely back, wanting to look every inch the respectable frontier wife. The courthouse was packed. News of the land dispute had spread, and entertainment was scarce in town. Clara took her seat beside Winters, ignoring the whispers. Across the aisle, James Morrison lounged with his Austin lawyer. Confident as cats, Judge Harper, thin and dyspeptic, called the court to order. Morrison's lawyer rose first, smooth as oil, painting a picture of Samuel Morrison as a devoted pioneer whose dreams were stolen by an opportunistic neighbor. "My client merely seeks his rightful inheritance," he concluded. "The land his cousin claimed improved, and would have proven up if not for circumstances beyond his control." Clara bit her tongue. Circumstances like abandoning a mail-order bride and fleeing to California. Winters rose shakily. "Your Honor, Lucas Hammond has worked that land for 3 years. Every improvement—" "Where is Mr. Hammond?" Morrison's lawyer interrupted. "If his claim is so strong, why isn't he here to defend it? He's returning from a cattle drive, business necessary to pay the disputed taxes, so he's absent." The lawyer's smile was sharp. "Just as he was absent during portions of the proving-up period, a pattern of abandonment, perhaps?" The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Winters, do you have witness to Mr. Hammond's improvements in continuous residence?" This was the moment. Clara stood. "I do, Your Honor." Surprise rippled through the crowd. Judge Harper frowned. "You are?" "Clara Hammond, Luke's wife. Wives cannot testify for or against their husbands in property matters." Morrison's lawyer said quickly, "I'm not testifying for my husband." Clara said clearly, "I'm testifying about the land itself, what I've observed, what I've worked myself." The judge considered. "Proceed, but carefully." Clara moved to the witness chair, placed her hand on the Bible, and began. She spoke of the ranch as she'd first seen it, every building tight against weather, every fence true, the garden plot carved from prairie through back-breaking work. She described the improvements she'd witnessed, the daily labor that went into maintaining a working ranch. "Abandoned land doesn't have tight fences and healthy stock," she said. "It doesn't have irrigation ditches dug arrow straight or a root cellar stocked for winter. That ranch bears my husband's sweat in every board and post." "You've been there only a few months," Morrison's lawyer pointed out. "You can't speak to earlier periods." "No," Clara agreed. "But I can speak to what 3 years of work looks like versus 6 months of absence. I've seen the Morrison place. It's already falling to ruin. Fences down, buildings weathering, land going back to prairie. That's what abandonment looks like." She pulled out her documentation, tax receipts, improvement lists, even sketches she'd made of the property boundaries. "This is what commitment looks like." Morrison's lawyer tried to shake her testimony, but Clara held firm. She knew every acre of the disputed section, every water source, every improvement Luke had made. When he suggested she was merely a fortune hunter protecting her meal ticket, she met his eyes steadily. "I came to this territory as another man's intended bride. When he proved false, Luke Hammond offered me shelter with no expectation beyond honest work. He married me to protect my reputation, not to gain a housekeeper. Everything I have, I owe to his decency. The least I can do is speak the truth about his character and his claim." A stir at the back of the courtroom made her look up. Luke stood in the doorway, hat in hand, moving stiffly but steadily. Their eyes met across the crowd, and something passed between them that made her throat tight. "Your Honor," she said, never looking away from her husband. "Luke Hammond is here." What followed was anticlimactic. Luke testified simply and directly about his improvements, his residence, his plans for the land. Frank Collier confirmed the cattle drive and its necessity. Even Mrs. Jefferson spoke up from the gallery about the Hammonds' obvious commitment to the ranch. Morrison's lawyer made increasingly desperate arguments, but the tide had turned. When Judge Harper finally ruled, it was decisive. The land belonged to Luke Hammond, proved up proper and defended with courage. Outside the courthouse, Luke caught Clara's hands. That was some speech. I meant every word. I know. He pulled her close, mindful of his sore ribs but unable to maintain distance. Frank said you held the ranch alone for 6 weeks. Said you shot that coyote. Winged him, Clara corrected. But he got the message. Luke laughed, then winced. Come on, Mrs. Hammond. Let's go home. They drove out of town side by side on the wagon seat. The Victory judgment tucked safe in Clara's reticule. The ranch appeared at sunset, golden light warming the modest buildings into something beautiful. I've been thinking, Luke said as he helped her down, about that promise you made, about when I got back from Kansas. Clara's pulse quickened. Oh? Seems to me I'm back. She smiled, suddenly shy. Seems you are. He kissed her then, there in the yard with the chickens pecking around their feet and the last light painting everything gold. When they finally went inside, it was together, crossing the threshold of more than just a doorway. Later, much later. Clara stood at the bedroom window, their bedroom now, watching stars pierce the vast Texas sky. Luke's arm curved around her waist, solid and warm. No regrets, he asked softly. This isn't the life you planned. Clara leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Plans change. Samuel Morrison promised me the moon in letters, and delivered dust. You promised me nothing but shelter, and delivered a home. Our home, he corrected, and she heard the wonder in it. Our home, she agreed. In the morning there would be chores, chickens to feed, stock to tend, the eternal battle against weather and wilderness. But they would face it together, partners in truth now, building something that no courthouse could grant or take away. The coyote called in the distance, but it was moving away, seeking easier prey. Clara smiled. Even predators recognized a territory well defended, a pair that wouldn't be separated by distance or challenge. She'd traveled west as one man's mail-order bride and became another man's salvation. Or perhaps they'd saved each other. Two souls finding home not in a place, but in the space between heartbeats, in small kindnesses grown to love. The stars wheeled overhead, constant as promises kept, bright as hope renewed. And in a small ranch house on the edge of forever, two people who'd started as strangers wrote their own ending, not with grand gestures, but with quiet certainty, building tomorrow on the solid ground of today. 5 years on, when folks told the story in town, they'd speak of the mail-order bride who'd defended her husband's land in court, who'd held a ranch alone for 6 weeks, who'd made Luke Hammond smile more in 1 year than in all the years before. But Clara liked better what the neighbor women said. Watching her children play in the yard she'd coaxed from Prairie. That's a true love match. Make no mistake. You can see it in how they look at each other, how they work together. Sometimes the best things come from the worst beginnings. And in the garden, where tomatoes finally grew tall and strong, Clara would pause in her work, shade her eyes to watch Luke teaching their son to ride, and know the absolute truth of it. Love wasn't always what you ordered from a catalog or planned in letters. Sometimes it was what grew wild and stubborn from whatever ground you were given, tended with patience and trust until it bloomed stronger than any storm could break. That was the love that built the West, not the dramatic kind sung in ballads, but the quiet kind that faced each day's troubles together and called it good enough. The kind that started with a woman standing by a broken-down wagon and a man offering shelter, and grew into something neither could have imagined but both would defend with their lives. The kind that lasted. Thank you all for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Please leave a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on Clara and Luke's journey. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share more tales of love and courage from the American frontier with you.